Help me, brother. I cried as I stumbled into his home on a freezing winter night. My clothes were torn and barely kept me warm. I held a baby in my arms, feeling desperate and scared. My brother stood there, speechless at the sight of me. I looked so changed and frail, wearing only a ripped shirt and no shoes. "What on earth happened?" he quickly asked, rushing me inside and trying to warm up the room. The baby, wrapped in my jacket, slept soundly, but I couldn't stop shaking. "Who did this to my precious little sister?" he muttered through clenched teeth. "Jennifer, it's going to be okay now." Hearing my brother's gentle voice brought me some relief. It was as if all the strength had drained from my body. "My name is Jennifer. I'm a 26-year-old homemaker with a young son. I used to be a nurse, but my life changed when Brian, the son of the hospital director, proposed to me. Brian was kind and good at his job, which initially drew me to him. I have a brother, Kevin, who is 5 years older than me. After our parents tragically died in a car accident when I was just 4, Kevin became my protector. Our parents died when their car was hit head-on by a truck whose driver had fallen asleep. My mother, also a nurse, was working late that night. It happened when my father went to pick her up after her shift. Just before he left, he told Kevin, 'I'm counting on you to take care of Jennifer.' Those words stuck with Kevin, and he took them to heart, always looking out for me. Since then, we never fought. He was like a superhero to me. After the accident, it seemed like Kevin and I would be sent to different foster homes. However, our paternal grandparents, whom we hadn't seen much until then, decided to take us in. When I first met our grandfather, his white hair and bushy beard made him look like a storybook Santa Claus. He looked at Kevin and said, 'You're the spitting image of your father.' I could swear I saw tears in his eyes. Our grandmother was a kind woman who hugged me tightly and cried, saying, 'Poor child.' Later, I learned that our father had fallen out with our grandfather. He had left home, wanting to escape the family business, while our grandfather insisted he'd take over. They had a bad parting, and their relationship was never mended. Kevin and I moved to our grandparents' house, which was tucked away in the rural mountains. Our grandfather was a well-known potter, whose creations were so famous that a single teacup could sell for thousands of dollars. Thanks to him, Kevin and I grew up without financial worries. Our grandfather was stubborn and hated dishonesty. He dedicated himself entirely to his work, while our grandmother was incredibly kind. Even without our parents, we found happiness under their watchful eyes. Kevin went to a prestigious university in the city, while I attended nursing school. We both had the chance to chase our dreams. However, when our grandmother's health began to decline, Kevin returned home from the city. I wanted to go back too, but as a student, Kevin advised against it. He had always been interested in our grandfather's pottery, but our grandfather insisted he should follow his own path. As Kevin learned pottery from our grandfather, I watched my brother excel at everything. Our grandfather regretted forcing our father to continue the family business and wanted to ensure that his grandchildren wouldn't have to face the same struggles. But Kevin was determined to learn pottery. He had always been good with his hands, and it seemed like a perfect fit for him. He excelled in academics, sports, and was popular among his friends. He truly was my superhero, taking care of our sick grandmother while mastering the art of pottery. While Kevin was learning from our grandfather, I graduated from nursing school and began working as a nurse. It was during this time that Brian proposed to me, and we got married in a beautiful ceremony. What I remember most from our wedding day are the joyful smiles of Kevin and our grandfather. Kevin brought pictures of our parents to the wedding and said, "We all just want you to be happy, Jennifer, including Mom and Dad." Tears streamed down his face, and our grandmother, too ill to attend, cried tears of joy when she watched the video of the ceremony. In that moment, I felt truly blessed to have such a wonderful family. After the wedding, I quit my job as a nurse and moved into Brian's family home, where I became a full-time homemaker. We welcomed a child into our lives, and Brian was kind and supportive. For a while, everything seemed perfect, and I couldn't have imagined the difficult days that lay ahead. Not long after, my grandmother passed away. Brian stood by my side during the funeral, comforting me as best he could. My grandfather was deeply disappointed, and I found it hard to speak to him. Meanwhile, Kevin threw himself even deeper into his pottery work, trying to cope with the loss. Then, 6 months later, I found myself crying for help as I fled to my brother's place in the middle of a freezing winter night. My clothes were ragged, and I held a baby in my arms. Kevin was speechless when he saw how drastically I had changed. I looked so thin and weak, wearing only a tattered shirt and no shoes. "What on earth happened?" he asked, quickly ushering me inside and warming the room. The baby, wrapped in my coat, slept soundly, but I couldn't stop shivering. "Who did this to my dear sister?" Kevin murmured through clenched teeth. Relief washed over me, as if all my strength had left my body. I didn't want to worry him or our grandfather, but I had no choice but to share what had happened. I began to recount the events at my in-laws' house. Brian and I had moved in with them because they thought I needed to rest during and after my pregnancy. My in-laws, both married, seemed like a genuinely close family, and I was happy that my child and I could be part of it. My father-in-law was kind to me, telling me to make myself at home. Having no father of my own, his kindness meant a lot to me. However, my mother-in-law did not seem to share the same warmth. She would accuse me, saying, "You're flirting with my husband, you disgusting woman." The harassment began when my father-in-law wasn't around. "You're just an uneducated child with no parents," she would taunt. The abuse escalated from verbal attacks to physical harm. She once spilled boiling water on me, planted pins in my meals, and even tried to push me down the stairs. It felt like a life-or-death situation. My mother-in-law's family had a long-standing reputation in the retail business, managing a major department store chain run by her brother. "Your background is miles apart from mine," she would say. "You can't blend with someone who grew up in poverty." She looked down on me. And then another problem arose that added to my troubles. Due to a shortage of staff at the hospital, a former nurse was often called in to help Brian. During this time, I noticed something unsettling. Brian, being the son of the hospital director, often reprimanded the nurses harshly. "Move quicker. You're a nurse and getting paid, aren't you? Don't slack off just because my father is lenient. Once I take over this hospital, I won't be so forgiving. How many times do I have to tell you to order the supplies in advance? They're not cheap, you know. Don't take running a hospital lightly," he would scold. His unreasonable remarks were directed at nurses who were working hard for their patients. "Brian, don't you think that's too harsh? Everyone here is trying their best," I interjected one day. He didn't take kindly to my comments. Furious that I had stood up to him, he exploded in front of the other nurses. From that moment on, Brian became distant toward me. This might have been influenced by my mother-in-law, who was telling him all along, "You're too soft on your wife. She's taking you for granted." My father-in-law was still well, so Brian couldn't be openly hostile or abusive in front of him. But then, my father-in-law fell seriously ill and became bedridden. When it rains, it pours. My mother-in-law seized the opportunity and made me take care of all the chores, treating me like a housekeeper. I was overwhelmed, carrying my son on my back while cooking, doing laundry, and cleaning, even in front of my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law began to mistreat me. "Please don't speak to Jennifer that way," my father-in-law would say. But my mother-in-law just replied, "Here you go again, defending that woman. You can't even do anything with your frail body. Oh, how I wish you were gone." I endured it all for the sake of my son and my father-in-law. The harassment escalated. "Housekeepers don't eat with the family. Family eat the leftovers later," she told me. I was so upset that I lost my appetite. When I looked in the mirror, I was shocked to see my gaunt and ragged reflection. Brian said to me one day, "I only married you because you were a bit attractive, but I never thought you'd become such a shabby woman. I'm too embarrassed to be seen with you." He told me to move from our bedroom to the storage room. How cruel could people be? My husband and mother-in-law began to verbally abuse even my son. "Of course he's not smart. Look at who his mother is," my mother-in-law would say. "His constant crying is annoying. Make him stop right now," Brian would demand. It felt like something inside me had snapped. I made up my mind to run away. My only concern was my father-in-law. If I didn't take care of him, who would? He would be in trouble. But my father-in-law said, "Don't worry about me, Jennifer. You should escape to your brother's place." He pulled out several $100 bills from under his pillow and pressed them into my hand. I decided to flee right then and there. Wearing the clothes I had on, I wrapped my son in my coat to keep him warm, rushed outside, and hailed a taxi. With the money my father-in-law had given me, I headed straight to my grandfather's house. I poured out the whole story to my grandfather and my brother, Kevin, all at once. Kevin had a furious expression I had never seen before. Shaking his clenched fist, he reassured me, saying, "You've had it tough, haven't you? It's okay now. Relax." I burst into tears as my grandfather muttered, "I can't forgive this." A few days later, I left my son with my grandfather and decided to return to my in-laws' house with Kevin to collect the belongings I had left in such a hurry. I knew it could cause trouble, but I thought it was best to do this quietly. When we arrived at my in-laws' house, Brian muttered with a cold gaze, "You finally returned, huh?" Kevin calmly replied, "My sister seems very distressed, so we'll be taking care of her for a while. We came today to collect some of her personal belongings." Brian shot back, "I married her, so if she doesn't come back, there will be no one to do the chores. That's a big problem for me." My mother-in-law looked down on Kevin and said, "I heard you do pottery. It must be a poor life, isn't it? Even if you take care of my daughter-in-law, it's going to be tough for you, right? Please send her back. It's a problem for us too." Kevin clenched his fists tightly, desperately trying to suppress his anger. When we asked to take my belongings, we were directed to a storage room in the corner of the hallway that served as my room. In that cramped space, there were cardboard boxes and old appliances carelessly piled up. A few changes of clothes for me and my son were there, but there were no heating appliances, just a thin blanket and a flimsy mattress. Kevin was at a loss for words when he saw the harsh conditions I had been living in. He glared at my mother-in-law, saying, "Is this where you shoved my dear sister and her child?" She retorted, "She should be grateful just to have a room. She's just a housekeeper." I wanted to get out of that house as soon as possible, but I was worried about my father-in-law. I wanted to see him. When I finally saw him, he quietly handed me something and apologized to Kevin for not being able to protect me. For several days after that, we made preparations with my grandfather. Then, Kevin and I headed back to my in-laws' house, determined to fight for my son. I knew I couldn't keep running away forever. When we arrived, I handed Brian the divorce papers. He looked taken aback for a moment, but then declared he wouldn't pay alimony or child support since I was choosing to leave. I played a recording of his mother belittling me and of him shouting at me. "This is evidence of the abuse I have suffered." I informed them. Brian and my mother-in-law looked shocked and asked, "When did you even record this?" It turned out my father-in-law had secretly recorded everything to help me. He had discreetly passed the recording to me, knowing it would be important. A few days after I left, I went to collect my things. Kevin, who had graduated from law school and passed the bar exam while helping our grandfather with his pottery work, told me, "You can get a divorce since your husband is at fault." Kevin had been actively practicing law to help people in our local community, and now he promised to fight for me wholeheartedly. My wheelchair-bound father-in-law showed up and handed the divorce papers to my mother-in-law. He had recorded all the verbal abuse he had endured and was ready to divorce her as well. He preferred living in a care facility rather than staying with her. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law burst into laughter. "All right, go ahead and divorce me. I'll return to my brother's house and go back to my luxurious life," she said. At that moment, my grandfather made a call. "I'll terminate any contracts with a family like this," he stated. It turned out the major department store run by my mother-in-law's brother was on the verge of bankruptcy. He had been eager to strike a deal to exhibit and sell my grandfather's famous pottery and was close to finalizing it. Just then, a call came from her brother, the department store owner, severing ties with her. My mother-in-law turned pale, muttering, "That's impossible," and sank to her knees. She finally seemed to understand her situation and started to beg. "Please forgive me. I was out of line. I have nowhere else to go. Please let me stay here. Jennifer, I'm sorry. Please forgive me." There was no way we could forgive her now. We all coldly stared at my weeping mother-in-law. However, one person still didn't seem to fully grasp the situation. It was my husband. He said to me, "I'm set to inherit this hospital. If you want a divorce, I'll pay alimony and child support. I'll marry someone younger and prettier than you." But then, my father-in-law said a single sentence. "The hospital has been sold." My husband's eyes widened in shock. What? In fact, Brian had been pulling strings behind the scenes at my father-in-law's request. "Get out of here right now," my father-in-law screamed at his stepson. Brian's face turned white. He wasn't legally adopted by my father-in-law, who was actually his stepfather, so he had no legal claim on his assets. On the other hand, I was legally adopted by my father-in-law, who had taken good care of me. Sensing the shift in events, my husband quickly changed his tune, pleading for a fresh start with me. I coldly dismissed him. Afterward, my son and I settled down and enjoyed life at my grandparents' house. He cried less often and spent his time playing in nature, discovering flowers and insects. My in-laws divorced, and the audio tape proved crucial in establishing my mother-in-law's fault. According to mutual acquaintances, my mother-in-law and Brian were now living in a small rented apartment. Their attempts to find new jobs were not going well, and they seemed to be getting by on part-time work. Their days were filled with endless arguments, each blaming the other for their situation. Meanwhile, my grandfather was living comfortably in a high-end senior home, and my son and I visited him often. Kevin continued to work with pottery under my grandfather's guidance. My mother-in-law's brother, who wasn't at fault, held the pottery exhibition at his department store. At the exhibition, my brother met a lovely woman who was a fan of pottery, and they started dating. I expect we'll hear good news from him soon. As for me, I work as a nurse at a hospital near my grandfather's house. It was my dream to become a nurse like my mother, and now I find fulfillment in caring for my patients.